Some new research from Christian Concern shows that Church of England churches with the largest levels of under 16 to attend show no visible support for same-sex marriage. They say this contradicts the argument that churches need to change their doctrine in order to reach younger people. In December, the Bishop of Oxford, Stephen Croft, argued that a whole generation of young people have been alienated from the church because of an unwillingness to allow same-sex marriage within the church. This is a theme which you can often see in some of the mainstream reporting on this subject, with it being widely suggested that it's the church's failure to fall into line with society's values which is seeing it struggle. Well, to talk about this research from Christian Concern in a bit more detail, I'm joined by Paul Huxley, who's the author of this research. Paul, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Some of the more cynical amongst us may point out that you've only looked at 33 Church of England churches out of about 16,000. Given that, how confident are you that this research paints a valid picture of where young people are at?
I think it's fair to say that the research is limited. It only looked at 33 churches because we went into quite a lot of detail with those churches. So we looked through their websites, we looked through Facebook and Twitter accounts, we listened to sermons, not all of them, but all we could reasonably find on those sorts of issues to try to determine where people were, looked at public statements from ministers and so on. So to do that for every single church would have been very difficult. But the 33 churches we chose were the ones that were announced by the Church of England to have the highest under 16s attendance in the years 2015, 2016 and 2017. So that's the most recent data that we have. So we're looking at the biggest ones to see, is it absolutely necessary for churches to change doctrine to actually reach these young people? And it didn't seem to be the case.
I think it would be difficult to argue at the moment that the Church of England isn't struggling when it comes to attendance. Now, I've seen politicians, commentators and various media pundits put this all down to the church's refusal to allow same-sex marriage. If your research is correct, then why is the C of E struggling so much?
Well, I think there are generational issues where some of the older generation would naturally go to church and they would consider themselves Christians. That's the kind of thing we see in the census data that's been coming out lately. The older generations can consider themselves Christians, and going to church is just a thing they do, whether they not necessarily have a faith or not, which is less the case with younger people. So there are issues like that. COVID, obviously, and the lockdowns with that was a complicating factor as well with church attendance. So there are these sorts of trends overall. But what I see on the sexuality issue is that I think that young people also want to see something that's a bit different to what's out there in the world anyway. They don't expect the church necessarily to believe everything that they believe, and some young people are actually quite fed up with some of what is being taught in schools and some of what is being pushed through the media as well. So there are lots of factors in it, and we definitely can't from this research tell all of those sort of details. But I don't think that sexuality is actually a huge issue in either way in whether people come to church or not.
It's a really fascinating discussion, and if we can go back to your survey for a moment, which has found that the churches with the largest levels of under 16s who attend show no visible support for same-sex marriage. So we're looking at attendance levels of under 16s. Now, I can picture many parents shouting at their radio right now saying that the only reason that their 16-year-olds and under attend their church is because they drag them along week after week. So how do we know that this is down to some kind of theological stance that the young people might have, or whether it's just down to the fact that their parents are dragging them along?
Yeah, I think that when children get to, say, 12, 13 or so, then they start to sometimes put up a bit more resistance to their parents. So maybe for those older ones, it might be more of a factor, but not so much for the younger ones. But what I'd say to that is that most people who think that the church needs to change would also say that the church is struggling to reach millennials for the same reasons. So I'm an older millennial. I'm 37 at the moment, and I've got young children. So it's people roughly my age who are bringing their younger children along as well. So if they're struggling, so if they need to change the doctrine to reach people like me and millennials and these sorts of people, then then they would be also struggling to reach those younger people as well. So I think it just pushes the question back a little bit. But I think they'd be struggling to reach millennials as well, if what they're saying is true.
Well, Paul, why do you think the church should continue to offer a different message to the ones that are being preached by our secular society?
Well, I think culture as a whole for some time has been saying go and pursue what you really want to do, be authentic to yourself, and particularly in the area of sex since the 1960s in particular, go and do what you want to do. And lots of people have seen the brokenness that has caused through divorces and through all kinds of difficulties people have faced and broken families and families that just have never seen a husband and a wife stay together to raise their children for a generation. And there's so much brokenness. People, I think, are struggling from that and struggling from not having connected properly with their mothers and fathers and so on. And this brokenness keeps on repeating itself. And at some point, people wake up to that. And I think we're starting to see in some cases, people realize maybe what's at fault is that thing at the beginning where we said, let's just go and do what we want and be authentic to ourselves and pursue whatever relationships we want to. So I think we're starting to see that does cause brokenness and look for alternatives. And I think the best one is found in the Christian vision, where sex is reserved for married men and women together.
Well, with that point in mind, some people might be listening to this conversation and saying, why should we care? And they might argue that our main mission is to continue sharing the gospel and making sure that people come into a relationship with Christ. I mean, are they right? Are we getting too tied up as a church in the world's vision and philosophies?
For sure. I mean, I think lots of Christians would really like not to have to talk about this for a long time. We've had enough of this in many ways, but it's on the cultural agenda whether we like it or not. It's happening. It's being talked about all the time in the news, even now with what's happening in Scotland and gender issues and prisons and so on. It's out there. It's happening. And if Christians don't have a strong response, then I think people will go to other sources to try and mend these sorts of situations, and they'll go to places. I mean, don't want to be too extreme, but places like Andrew Tate, or Jordan Peterson, or other places people who are not Christians and who have their own visions, which may be bad, may be somewhat good, who knows? But they will be looking for answers on these issues either way, and it's up to Christians to use the Bible, use what God has revealed about these things, to speak something fresh and something good for people.
Paul Huxley from Christian Concern, thank you very much for joining us on the programme today.